All right, now we can hear me. All right, how's everybody doing? Excited to be back in person at conferences again. Still kind of weird. I'm like, oh, this is what people look like. Normally it's just like Zoom, no feedback as a speaker where you're like, well, I hope that joke landed. I think I'm funny. All right, but today we are going to get started talking about the problems micro front ends won't solve. So just curious, how many people have heard the term micro front end? Okay, how many think they have a solid idea of what the hell micro front ends are? Okay, about what I expect. Okay, my name is Jennifer Wadella. You can follow me on Twitter at OMG@Sveti. I'm the director of Angular development at a consultancy called Batovi. The longer I stay in consulting, the more I see clients doing dumb things that lead to me writing conference talks saying, hey, stop doing these dumb things. Plenty of horror stories and fun things to share. I'm also the co-host of the Angular Plus show. It is traditionally in its roots an Angular podcast, but we too talk a lot about technology. We actually did a 4-part series on micro front ends a couple months ago, and I've got links to that later in the slides. So we'll get people a chance to kind of get settled in. Still got a couple trickling in. Everybody start cruising the food already? I love a conference that keeps me fed all the time. Like I'm normally hangry like nonstop. So anytime I can like duck out for a snack, I'm super happy. But I feel like this is a really accurate way to kick off this talk. I don't know if y'all have seen the Chris Pine meme floating around on Twitter, just looking obscenely annoyed and disinterested in what's happening. But this is definitely what I look like when I'm on a client call and they start telling me, well, we're going to implement micro front ends. And I'm like, honey, I don't think you should be doing that, but let's listen and let's talk about why. Okay, so what are micro front ends? We're gonna hit you with this definition first, which is an architectural style where independently deliverable front-end applications are composed into a greater whole. And much like all of our tech definitions, this is just a bunch of spaghetti nonsense that doesn't necessarily make sense until you start to think about how or why you would actually consider using this architectural style for deploying your front-end application. So the best way I like to talk about micro front-ends is starting with a demo of, okay, here is what this could look like, here's why you might use it, and kind of help break it down for people. So I've got a sample application that I will show you all, and this is, let's pretend this is an e-commerce website where capitalism rules, we want to sell more products, we want to empower our software engineering teams to help our product teams sell more products. And so in order to do that, we want teams that are going to be able to focus on just a single feature at a time. So in my demo, is this super tiny for everybody? All right. My very glamorous CSS, we're going to pretend that we are selling Animal Crossing villagers. I got into a big Animal Crossing kick at the beginning of the pandemic, and so I use their API a lot for my demos. But this is an example of a front-end application where a user is going to come to our website. They are looking for Animal Crossing villagers, and they are expecting a seamless experience. They should not have any idea or any understanding of how the different pieces of this application are composed. They are just able to do what they want. Us as a company, we are thinking, okay, I need to display a list of products for my customers to be able to choose from, see some information around. So I'm going to build an engineering squad, pod, whatever your terminology is, and that team is just going to focus on delivering a list of products that our customers can get. That's going to be their only focus. They're going to deploy it whenever they need changes or updates. They're going to maintain any filtering or mechanisms or anything. So example use case. So in the UI that you're seeing here, we've got our navigation, which is one micro front end, and then we've got this list application that is a separate micro front end. I'll share the link to this demo. These are just separate Angular applications that are running independently and then being pulled together using a framework called Single SPA. Okay, so let's say we click into one of these products. We are going to load a different route, and here we have still a same cohesive feeling single-page application, but this is composed of 3 different micro front ends in this case. We still have our navigation at the top. We have an actual product application, and so the product team has built this. Their only focus is to show you all the information about this product, make you really want to buy the product. But then business was like, hey, you know what, we think it would be really, really helpful to sell even more products if we show similar items to what this existing product is. And so we have this other micro frontend called Similar Villagers, where we are going to get information about the product that we are displaying and then build functionality that just shows, hey, these are other things you might like to buy because we have determined they're similar based on whatever API. And so again, we are serving a cohesive experience to the user, or at least we're going to try to. But these are all independently deployed applications at this point. So if I am a developer on the Similar Villagers team, I am going to be in my little home, and this is, excuse me, my code demo, where my structure might look something like this, where I am using a mono repo, and then for every micro frontend I have a different directory. So typically with micro frontends, you're going to start with what might be called a container or a host. This is where you're going to stitch everything together. And so in here, this demo is using single spa. And one of the things I really like about single spa is I feel like it's a really good intro way to get into micro frontends because it provides you a lot of framework and tooling right out the box where you can at least get a demo going. If you're trying to do a proof of concept, evaluate whether this is a reasonable concept for your company or not, this is a really great way to go, even if it doesn't ultimately end up being what you use in production. I say this because as a primarily Angular developer, single spa actually does not support more modern versions of Angular because Angular rewrote the compiler and they just don't have the open source support. That being said, this is a great place to start. And so what this main file is doing is it is pulling in all of my different micro frontends. And so this is just a local served instance. So every one of these is served at a different localhost port. And then we're combining them here. Okay, one of the cool things I like about single spa a lot is when you start like getting into micro frontends, we're having to solve a lot of things that we've already solved when we're using modern frameworks. So we are literally having to think all over again, how am I actually inserting this content into the DOM? Because at the end of the day, that's all we're doing, right? Is we're taking JavaScript, we're loading into the DOM, it is doing presentational stuff, and then we are displaying that to a user. But it can be really, really scary when you get away from that like concept of like our HTML page where we have our markup, we have our layout. So one of the reasons I like getting started with single spa is they provide an API where you can do this template approach, and you can basically build out visually what you would think of what your app's going to look like. Okay, nav's up here, my list is going to be here. When I navigate to my list or my certain products, I'm going to have my product display information here, and my similar villagers here. And so you can add your styling and break down everything, and you can also target what your paths look like here. So kind of quick, easy demo of what a micro frontend looks like in practice, what kind of the how you would stitch things together. But I'm hoping you're starting to see potential problems that you might run into in this. Boom, boom, boom. All right. So if you go to microfrontends.org, there are a lot of core ideas behind micro frontends, and they sound really glamorous until you start to think about the practicality. So number one is being technology agnostic. How many people are front-end developers in here? Okay, how many of you are developing in a specific framework or library like React or Angular or Svelte or Vue? Yeah. How many of you would be super excited about having to go write in something else just because you're on a new team? Okay, a couple people are ambitious, right? But a lot of us have kind of like settled into where we want to be, and that's where we want to hang out. And so there's this idea of, oh, okay, if we have all these different teams that are building their applications and can deploy it independently, they can be technology agnostic. They can choose whatever framework they want. It's going to make hiring a lot easier for us, and then we can still all bring them together in a single application. Sounds great in theory. In execution, a bit of a different practice. One of the other ideas behind micro frontends is being able to isolate team code. So we can say, all right, we're just focusing on showing similar products. So that's going to be a very narrow vision. We only have to understand this small slice of the business. We only have to understand this small slice of how the back end works, what those APIs look like in order to be able to focus and serve this. Establishing team prefixes actually is key because we need to be able to understand when we are looking at our code what belongs to what, and when you have a whole bunch of independent teams, you already have a hard enough time getting us developers to talk to each other in one team. Try spreading that across a bunch of teams, running their own meetups, their own stand-ups, and everything. So having team prefixes and a lot of commonality in the way you create and kind of label your applications is a big deal. All right, now, bullet point number 4 is where we start to get really problematic. And this recommendation is to feature native browser features over custom APIs. But what are we doing all the time when we're in frameworks like React or Angular? We're not interacting with native DOM APIs at all. That has all been abstracted away from us. And if you look at the current state of the market, we've got a lot of bootcamp grads that didn't grow up like my generation. I joke about, like, I was a jQuery kid, right? So I am used to being hands-on with the DOM injecting. I understand exactly what I'm doing. But we have a whole generation of developers who have not grown up with that experience. They've grown up with these abstractions. And so they don't even have an understanding of what's happening under the hood. Like, how are we actually injecting this content into the page? How are we removing things? How are we appending to the DOM? And so by making that a core tenet of understanding micro frontends, then why are we technology agnostic at all if we are going to favor those native DOM APIs over the way we've been doing them with our frameworks? So you're already throwing in a huge learning curve here, and it's a knowledge gap that is really hard to overcome. A lot of the modern ways we do things in tech are because we've spent years solving the same problems over and over and over again and have come to these solutions. And if you weren't part of the crowd that dealt with those problems to understand the solutions, it's a very hard gap to bridge. So, micro frontends, a great idea, but they are not without their problems. And I do see a lot of people reaching to micro frontends as, this is going to solve all our problems. Oh, this is the new cool shiny thing. We need to use this. We need to use this. We need to use this. No, you probably don't. All right. There are actually relevant reasons to adopt a micro frontend strategy. So in Angular land, we had a major upgrade. So we had AngularJS back in the day, and then when modern Angular 2.0 Plus came out, that requires an entire rewrite of an application. And so this is the world I deal in a lot, where I've got clients, they're dealing with legacy AngularJS code. It actually reached end-of-life support by the Google team, I think, January this year. They kept pushing the deadline back, but it is officially dead. It is no longer supported. And so we have a lot of companies with these just massive AngularJS code bases going, shit, how do we upgrade? We can't write everything at once. So one of the things micro frontends can allow us to do is upgrade a legacy application small pieces at a time. And I've actually done this on a client. They didn't do it well, but they got a step in the right direction. So very reasonable strategy to follow kind of like the strangulation pattern and start to split apart pieces of your application, move it to a more modern framework, and do that way instead of having to do a whole massive rewrite at once. And God knows if it's that old, you probably didn't document it in the first place, and that is not a lot of fun to deal with. So we can break it apart in small pieces at a time, deploy, test, and have focus there. One of the other decent reasons is to reduce the difficulty in shipping features in a timely manner. So when you're dealing with a massive code base, everything has to be in working order in order to get deployed. When you move to a micro front-end strategy, you're breaking things into smaller pieces, and so as feature teams are working, they can do their fixes according to their deadlines, according to their business priorities, and get that shipped and out the door. Again, I don't recommend this, but this is what people keep pushing for, is it does allow teams to use their preferred tech stack. So if you're having trouble hiring, if you've got those grumpy people who just refuse to step outside their box, this can be a way to do that. And I do like, in theory, the concept of embracing feature-oriented teams. A big part of being a developer is learning about the business that we're building for, right? Because it's not just about the code, we're building for users. And in order to build for the users and build for the users well, we have to have a good understanding of what we're building. What are they expecting? What are their goals? What are they trying to do with our application? And if you can split that into smaller chunks, it's a lot less to comprehend. My team just moved off a project for Aflac, building insurance software, and like the rules involved in this, it's just a nightmare. You can take a day just reading requirements, trying to understand the business logic, let alone trying to figure out how to implement the state management for everything that you need to do. So instead of having to tackle this entire giant business thing, we can have a small feature or a small very focused feature-oriented team that is very familiar with their business needs and can write code against that. So that's kind of high-level reasons why I think that are legitimate, and so there are problems that Micro Frontends can't solve. I don't want to bash the entire time, but I just want to kind of give you the realistic picture of this is what it looks like, this is what you can use them for, here are the million problems that you're going to run into when you're solving these couple problems that I'm about to talk about. All right, so like I mentioned, Micro Frontends allow you to do incremental upgrades. We can avoid a massive full application rewrite by just doing small feature replacements. We can move towards smaller decoupled code bases. So pretty much everything in this talk has a good aspect to it and a bad aspect to it. So by breaking apart our micro frontend, or breaking apart our application in micro frontends, we are forcing to have smaller decoupled code bases. So we're getting away from tightly coupled components because each application needs to own its own feature, and so it cannot be tightly coupled or dependent on something else. And this is going to force us to be thoughtful about sharing events and data. But the problem we run into is we have to basically reinvent the wheel. In Angular, we really like RxJS for communication, sharing events, dealing with data. We might use a state management framework like NGRX. Well, what happens when we have something going on in our Angular application that wants to communicate to a similar application that is React? Maybe they both need to share the same state. We're going to run into a lot of problems very, very quickly. We can replicate the code, but what if that means we're going to be replicating API calls? That could get expensive. We're replicating code. Oh, okay, all of a sudden we are dealing with more code base bloat because we're loading two of the same amounts of code on the page to do the same thing, just in two different frameworks. So it kind of forces us to do things in the right way, but it opens us up to a lot of risk as well. Like I mentioned before, we can have product-focused teams. So in the example application I showed you, we would have a list team, and they have UXers, they have front ends, they have back-end developers, and these people are just focused on their small, narrow section of the business, what their feature is, and how to do the best job getting that to the user. We can have autonomous teams that can do whatever framework they want. And there are a significant amount of companies using micro frontends and using micro frontends successfully. I'll talk about him a little bit in this talk, but Zach Jackson is one of the creators of Module Federation, which is one of the bigger tools that we've been using in deploying micro frontends built in Webpack, and he's done a lot of this work at Lululemon. So there are valid use cases. A lot of these companies are just simply too big to consider anything other than a micro frontend strategy. Whether they're executing well or not and making their developers' lives miserable is a different story, but this is happening actively and in production. So I mentioned Module Federation already, but there are a lot of different micro frontend approaches. There are a lot of people who've been doing micro frontends for 10 years, like before we even called them micro frontends, just by injecting stuff via iframes. It sounds dirty, it sounds nasty, it's opening you up to some security vulnerabilities, but for some things it does work. Some people do server-side compilation. One of the clients that I was working with, basically, we were doing kind of like route-based triangulation, where we would have one route with a whole bunch of features. We'd rebuild that in the new micro front end. We had Java running on the back end that we would basically switch on and off based on routes, what code that we were loading in. So you can do server-side compilation. You can use stitching frameworks like Single SPA. Again, I really love Single SPA if you are just wanting to get a proof of concept out the door. I think it's like the easiest way you can get something up and running to get your hands on to play with. And then you can go custom with Module Federation and Webpack. In Angular, Webpack is built into what we use all the time. So we were very quick to opt into Module Federation, and there's a lot of support around it. Are there any NX users in here? Yeah, okay. So NX is primarily a tool for mono repos, but they have a lot of great plugins and support, and they actually have some great plugins around Module Federation that do a lot of bootstrapping work for you. And this is just, there's a lot of conversation around micro front ends and the problems that we're trying to solve with them. So there is a new web platform API proposal called Portals, which is essentially a custom element that would allow us to inject custom elements into pages. So fun stuff happening in the space, fun stuff to research, but I don't think we're there yet with a solid solution. So if you're still like, all right, Jennifer, you know what, whatever you've said sounds fine. Micro Frontends sound awesome, let's go. I want to caution you and say, hold on, you little Frankensteins. Let's really start to talk through some of the issues that we can run into. All right, so scenario number one, your team has decided, all right, we're going to implement Micro Frontends, we've split everything out, it's fine. So we have a feature team and they start to work on a new feature. And they are going down their merry path. They have tunnel vision because they just know what they're trying to build and what they're trying to do at the end of the day. But in doing so, they are replicating a bunch of utility functions and API requests in code that has already been made for similar data. And then this gets deployed to production, and then your users are pissed. They're like, why is the website so slow? Everything is slowing down. Performance is terrible. This is a really real scenario that you're going to start to run into quickly. And because everybody is tunnel vision and focused, you might not have mechanisms in place to say, hey, where did this performance issue come from? What is the big picture? Because at the end of the day, we're still trying to serve that seamless experience to the user. And when everybody is fragmented, not listening to what anybody else is doing, this is a really common situation to start running into. Let's see here. So scenario number two, we have a critical bug that gets logged over the weekend. But how do we know who gets that bug? Like, how does the reporter know which squad, which team to assign it to? Which micro front end did this bug even occur in? So immediately we were starting to see, hey, how are we going to possibly figure out what's the proper course of action when people are encountering something? Again, it's a whole website, it's a whole experience to the user. And they don't know what's going on under the hood. They don't know that this is a piece, and this is a piece, and this is a piece, and this is a piece. So how do we begin to handle who owns responsibility for fixing what bug? All right, so we've got scenario number three. The UX team dreams up a brilliant new design. And let's refer back to the kind of that slide where I was showing you what these feature team slices could look like, where you've got a UX member, you've got a front-end team member, you've got a back-end team member. All right, so this UX team member implements this new design, but they're not checking in with the rest of the UX team. So all of a sudden, your little micro front end looks completely different from the rest of the application. Writing a new custom CSS, maybe the team's like, oh, we're going to use Tailwind on this, and they go crazy, and so all of a sudden you have this very discordant look and feel. This is something that happens. And it can be very hard to verify if you don't have good overhead understanding or a united team. Scenario number four, we have a dev team. They're working on their micro front end. They ship a change request that they have gotten on their app. They have unit tests because they are doing their best, but this change actually breaks another app that has a dependency on this. Whose responsibility is that? How are they supposed to deal with that? How are they supposed to communicate that their change request is going to affect something else? Maybe things are coupled, maybe they are dependent on API changes or something like that. So another very common situation that you're going to start to run into very quickly with micro front ends, and then having to figure out how to problem solve your way out of. All right, and scenario number five, you have a mid-level engineer on a feature team, and they encounter a weird error. And the reference point I'm going to make here is Angular specific, but this can apply anywhere. So Angular's change detection system is built on top of Zone.js, and a lot of senior Angular developers will not touch anything to do with Zone.js. It is just this crazy enigma of complexity. But when you are serving a bunch of Angular applications running alongside each other, they might all be running their own instances of Zone.js. And you're going to run into some really quirky behavior really, really quickly that even your mid-level engineers are going to see that error in the console and be like, I don't know what's going on. And it's going to be very, very difficult to debug and work through these issues. So with micro front ends, we are having to resolve a lot of problems that we've already solved, taking our typical framework-based single-page application approach, where these libraries and these frameworks, with very, very smart people working on them, have solved them for us already. And if you do not have an engineering team at that level of expertise to debug when you start to run into some of these hiccups that you're getting because you're having to reinvent the wheel, you are going to just completely throttle your ability to, get code out the door because the team level just isn't that skill level. Again, I'm in consulting, so I see a terrifying range of software engineers, but I'm going to say 90% of what I work with are backend developers that have gotten drop-kicked into front-end because it's easy, right? And you try and get a backend engineer started on RxJS, let alone like Zone.js understanding for Micro Frontends, and you're just asking for a bad day that even a month of training is not going to get you around. So you are just adding layers and layers of complexity that your team might not be equipped at this point to deal with figuring out how to debug, how to get around some of these problems. Problems that Micro Frontends can't solve, which is a lot. I hear a lot of different reasons from my clients on why they think they want Micro Frontends. They want to reduce code duplication. They want to be able to deploy faster. I had one client that they had an Angular 11 application. They had some new code they wanted to write, and they wanted to do an Angular 12, but they didn't want to upgrade their existing application from 11 to 12. And just for context, this is not a hard upgrade, y'all. Like, there has not been a really tough upgrade in Angular since Angular 6. Like, everything is we don't deal with a whole lot of breaking changes. Pretty much the most you're going to deal with, and even when they rewrote the compiler, that was not enough to be a breaking change for most applications. The most things that are going to happen are some things you weren't supposed to be doing before anyway that are warnings are now an error. But anyway, so they're like, oh, well, we just don't want to upgrade, so we want to do Micro Frontends so we can just write this new functionality in Angular 12. And I was like, no, bad idea, bad call. But with Micro Frontends, shipping good, small, maintainable, clean code is hard. It's hard. It requires so many different things. And Micro Frontends can help in some of these situations, but they're not the silver bullet that people think they are. Doing good code, solving these problems, sometimes takes non-technical solutions. It takes better process. It takes better communication. And we reach for tech. I saw a really great tweet the other day that was like, you can't code your way out of a culture problem. And I really feel like that's what people are trying to do with Micro Frontends, is they're reaching to this to say, oh, this is going to solve all our problems, when in reality it might solve one of your problems, because it's going to produce 60. And if you don't have your communication and your process locked down, you're just going to completely strangle your teams. So like I mentioned, we are reinventing the wheel. So you have a whole bunch of new architecture problems that you need to solve. You need to figure out how to do cross-app communication. And there's just always going to be this competition between, okay, these single Micro Frontends should be completely independent from each other. They should do their own thing, but then you're risking a lot of code duplication, risking repeated API calls. And so then you're going to look for, okay, how do we communicate and share data differently? But as soon as you run into different framework agnostic teams, that's going to become an interesting issue to kind of handle. So we, again, are having to reinvent the wheel of just how do we communicate between pieces of our front end. We have to worry about avoiding bloat due to complicated code. Performance matters. We need to be thinking about how much JavaScript we are serving to the browser. Especially if you're in the e-commerce space, like SEO is king, y'all. If your website is slower than your competitors, you're not making any sales, and then business is really not happy. I also see people wanting to share common code and figure out good ways to do this. And one of the struggles I do, I think mono repos are great in a lot of instances. And a lot of times when I'm hearing clients say they want Micro Frontends, I'm like, well, if you had a well-maintained mono repo, you could very easily share these libraries and share these codes if you're thoughtful about the way you do that. But you are having to figure out how to share common code again, share common utility libraries. We talk about another big gap. Angular, we're TypeScript kids. Like, that's what we love, that's what we do. And so there's a lot of power in TypeScript, but if you're trying to share like interfaces or something, or common code patterns, and maybe you're dealing with a team that's not using TypeScript, that can be a lot of complications in how you're sharing your common code. Consistent style in UX is a big deal. This is not necessarily a development concern, but when you're moving towards these independent feature teams, if they don't have good communication, then they're going to be going rogue, doing all sorts of different design things. With developers, I don't know about you, but I have not written like reasonable CSS in the last like 5 years. I pretty much stopped at Flexbox. And so having a bunch of developers trying to keep up with UX changes across the board can be really problematic. That being said, one of the trends I do like with Micro Frontends is the adoption of design systems and component libraries. That makes our lives a lot easier and can solve a lot of these problems. But maintaining that consistent style in US, especially for all those little kind of additional CSS things. We need to worry about margin, padding, making sure things look consistent. Like, how do we do that? If we have my example demo application where we're trying to lay out things a different way, who's responsible for what and the way they adjust? So you're having to reinvent the wheel on this. Deployment automation is also huge. So many of my clients that start talking about micro frontends can't even deploy one application. I'm like, you can barely get this working. How are you going to deal with deploying 20 different applications at different times? And the thing with micro frontends is they all need to be hosted somewhere. And so they're hosted somewhere. What happens if one of those is down? Or what happens if one of those is hosted on your local corporate NPM registry, and sometimes it can take 5 hours for that to propagate, and who has time to babysit that to inform QA to let them know when they're allowed to go test those changes? So you really have to have your deployment stuff figured out, and then you have to have it figured out X times how many ever micro frontends you have. Code quality maintenance is hard enough with a single team. Again, you are making this 10 times harder with however many micro frontends that you have. Enforcing code quality standards is really, really tough. We're dealing with this with one of my clients right now where they have several distributed squads that are building these applications that kind of work together. Just getting them to all be executing against the same code quality is incredibly difficult. We are still dealing with like people just blindly pushing PRs that haven't even passed tests yet. And so when you're moving to this micro front-end approach, you're giving those teams autonomy, but then if you do not have the structure and the leadership in place to support and make sure that those teams are focusing on code quality, you're going to have some really spotty things happening in random applications. I mentioned already, we have to deal with breaking changes between applications. Who's going to own that? Whose responsibility is that? How do we work on addressing those issues when they arrive? And this is a really fun one that we don't think about because, again, with our frameworks today, they have abstracted so many things away from us, and I'm just going to keep it really simple. Like, we're injecting stuff in the DOM, we're removing stuff in the DOM. That's, at the end of the day, like how a single-page application is doing a lot of its work. And these frameworks have abstracted away that teardown functionality. We don't even think about it because it's done for us. But when you're dealing with micro front-ends, okay, then all over again, we have to think about that. Okay, when this component should no longer be rendered, when this application should no longer be rendered, how are we handling that? How are we making sure our event handling is cleaned up? How are we going to make sure that we're not creating memory leaks? So again, solving a couple problems with micro front-ends, but then giving us all these new problems to solve that have already been solved before in just a single-page application framework. Testing is also really, really interesting. Let's say, okay, unit testing is easy enough, right? We're just testing, the functions of our code. Does that work at a very granular level? But if you're writing end-to-end tests, where do your tests start and where do they begin? If your feature is dependent on a login and those login credentials are needed for your API call, where is your responsibility? Do you have to go through that entire route to just test your micro front end? So there are a lot of questions that start to come up about who owns what this testing looks like, what's going to work for our team. So can we adopt micro front ends in profit? Questionable. I hope you're thinking about this and thinking about the reasons to do it, but then also the trade-offs. But I do want to say, okay, you can adopt this as a strategy and triumph. But it's going to be hard, and it's not going to be code-based with how you do this. So number one, if you want to adopt and be successful and triumph the micro front-end strategy, your communication needs to be locked down. One of the first things you can do is consider adopting consumer-driven context. So if you decide you're going to go to an approach where your micro front-ends might have some different dependency on each other, you're going to want to get contracts in place where you're going to say, hey, this is what we're responsible for. This is what we're responsible for. This is what's going to happen if you change this. This is what's going to happen if you change this. This is what you owe me. This is what I owe you. And so this isn't just documentation. This is actually like an agreement of how we are going to continue working together in these independent shipping environments. One of the quickest ways I see micro frontends fall down is they just drop kick everybody into squads, right, and say, okay, go on your merry way. But they don't provide any technical leadership or technical oversight. I heard this term a while ago of like a technical shepherd. And so they're not necessarily an engineering manager, they're not necessarily a technical lead, they're just that person keeping their eye on the herd, right? They are kind of making sure everything's in check with what it needs to do. So with one of the clients that we were dealing with micro frontends, one of the problems that we ran into very, very quickly was their, what do they call themselves? They had like a different term for UX. But they were very, very particular about what everything looked like, and they wanted to verify everything before it went to production. But the problem was, because nobody had like a big picture of the different micro frontends, as we were cutting off parts of the Angular JS code and replacing with the new Angular code, nobody had an overhead picture of what pieces had been updated and deployed yet and could be ready for review or not. And so we would get into all these meetings where something would look wrong or something hadn't been verified, and nobody could say what the state of the entire application was. Like, you could find that one engineer, and they might be able to look at deploy logs to figure out like when their latest micro frontend was deployed, but nobody was paying attention to the big picture to be like, all right, this is the roadmap of what our entire application looks like. This is the state of all these different micro frontends and where they are. So you have to have technical leadership in place who's going to look at this, or having a shepherd per se, who is keeping an eye on everything, who is making sure that everybody is aware of the current state of things. I feel like that is the biggest thing you can do to foster communication, because everybody working in these independent silos, we just get into what we're doing and you don't think about what everybody else is doing. So the next thing you need to focus on is collaboration. So a really great example is trying to just like track down bugs or identify what's going on. CSS is a great example of this, where you might have done something in your application, but somebody else drop kicks their CSS in, and they use that little bang important tag, and now all your shit is ruined. So we need to be very, very conscious about the ways we can affect things. Maybe your team is going crazy on window.global and slapping stuff and overriding things there. We're, again, loading all the same code in the same index.html page, right? So we're not foolproof. So one of the things you need to do is agree on naming conventions where you can't completely isolate things. So namespacing things accordingly with whatever maybe your micro frontend is can give people an idea, kind of like a smell of where to go to figure out the source of something. And so this can help when you have that shepherd or that technical leadership in place, where they're kind of keeping that overhead picture and being like, all right, let's make sure everything is tagged accordingly, so we can know and be able to trace through and understand where these things might be coming from. So you need to really, really focus on your deployment. I'm getting to that point in conversations where the second I hear a micro front end from a client, I immediately start asking them, hey, what's your DevOps look like? Hey, how's application deployment going? Can I talk to your engineers and have them tell me about their experiences of when they're ready to deploy code and what that kind of thing looks like? Because your micro front ends are only going to be as good as your ability to successfully and seamlessly deploy them. Because if that's one of your main goals, right, being able to ship features faster, being able to ship this independently, you have to be able to ship for that to work. So if you do not have good CI/CD infrastructure in place in the first place, you're just going to be fighting an uphill battle. So this is something that you really need to focus on before even considering looking at your front end and breaking that apart into micro front ends. Who loves writing documentation? Yeah, that tracks. I feel like, as a consultant, I feel like all I say to my team all the time is like, if it's not documented, it does not exist. And no, if you wrote it in Slack, that does not count as documentation. I'm sorry. But documentation is one of the best things that you can do to help successfully embark on a micro front end journey. You want to document your code styles. You want to document what those prefixes look like. What are your dependencies? What does deployment look like? And more. Because in reality of micro front ends, let's talk about these feature teams. Well, you might build a feature, and then that feature is good to go, and there's no more iterating to be done. So those developers aren't just going to sit idle, right? They are going to get shuffled into a new squad, into a new team. They're going to get rearranged, or somebody's going to quit, and they're going to have to backfill in that squad. And so that person is then going to have to go learn this new micro front end. And you know what's going to make that a lot easier for them to get up and running quickly? Documentation. So the more you can document how your app is running, especially if people are going to be jumping around into different contexts, that's really, really going to help you a lot. The other thing to be aware of is micro front-end tooling is still really, really new. Well, okay, other than iframes. But there's a lot evolving. Like, it's a very exciting time to be in this space. Like, these are relevant problems that we're trying to figure out how to solve. But again, micro front-ends are not the silver bullet. They are a direction we can start going in, but not something to wander into naively. So it's fun to be aware of what's going on. It's fun to kind of like watch, but a lot of these things are very new. They're not well documented. Like I mentioned, there's a library that I love, Single SPA, but they're open source and they simply have not been able to keep up with current versions of Angular. So anybody on a modern version of Angular can't even look to that for a solution. So big picture here. Micro frontends solve business problems, not technical ones, okay? Because even if you're like, hey, we want to deploy faster, is that a technical problem or is that to satisfy the business? It's to satisfy the business. So if you're looking at adopting micro frontends, or maybe somebody has brought up this buzzword and they're like, hey, all the cool kids are doing this, and you're like, well, I don't know if I want to be one of the cool kids. If your problem isn't directly related to a product or business need, you probably don't need micro frontends. If you do want to get started, because I do advocate like playing around, figuring things out for yourself, figuring out how they could work for your team, and doing prototypes. I do have a lot of resources up here. So number one is Single SPA. One of my team members has a blog on our website called How to Build a Micro Frontend with Webpack's Module Federation. If you have experience with Webpack, God bless them, their documentation is not always the best. And so my team members actually like gone and dug through all the source code to actually like get all the options and configurations for you and explain what they need in human language. So that's a really great resource. Like I mentioned, the podcast that I do, the Angular Plus show, we talked about micro frontends with one of, I don't know, godfathers, forefathers, I don't know what like the appropriate term would be. Luca, I really love his takes and his experience. He's just got very robust, very practical, very pragmatic experience at scale with a lot of front ends, so love that. And then if you follow Zach Jackson on Twitter, like pretty much all he's tweeting about these days are what he's working on with micro front ends. I think he's recently been working on Next.js support and kind of building that in. So all sorts of great resources to kind of learn more and equip yourself to make sure that if you're going to embark on this micro front-end journey, that it makes sense, you're well supported, and you are prepared to encounter all the scary, scary issues that I listed out for you. These slides are available at microfrontendproblems.jenniferwadella.com, so you can actually get all the links there. But I did want to leave time for any questions or horror stories, if anybody has anything. So questions about micro front ends, or yes?
It's interesting that you didn't mention security, because we have micro front ends in the channel that I'm working on, where we have a lot of distributed teams delivering stuff, and the big challenge we have is that we have no idea how they implement authorization. We have a common authentication model, but we have no idea about how they are actually, what they're validating.
Yep. Yeah, so I'm just like exhausted even thinking about like, yeah, security, like that's just one of a thing. Like there are a million things you're gonna run into, whether it's like security, how they've implemented this, how they've implemented that, that you will run into very, very quickly. That is absolutely a significant problem for micro front ends, especially if you already don't know what your front-end team is doing, then you definitely don't know what that back-end team is doing, and it's just a recipe for disaster unless you have good communication, good documentation, and good process. Is that a hand? Yeah. Yes, okay.
I noticed for your demo that you basically were using kind of a one solution fit. So inside of that solution, would you compose that of smaller Git repositories collaborating together? Would you split it into separate Git repositories?
It really depends. So my preferred approach, again, would be a mono repo that you can deploy independently and kind of say where you're going to deploy things. You can do Git repositories, that's fine. I've seen NPM registries used. The nice thing is you can customize according to your needs. So I don't have hard preferences around this, other than understanding that whatever solution you choose, that deployment piece is critical. And so if that is problematic for one, it's going to be problematic for all.
So wouldn't pull request require that someone at a high level review them all the time, I guess, if you go with a mono repo?
Yeah, well, one of the cool things with mono repos you can do is you can give certain people permissions over certain applications, and so you can kind of fragment that out if you need. It would be my dream to be in a scenario where there is like one shepherd reviewing pull requests, but that's not the reality I see across most of my clients. It's the wild, wild west, so. All right. Well, I hope this was informative, if not horrifying for some of you. I hope you have a great rest of your conference, you lovely human beings.